it's known internationally now as the Cuban model, this Cuban literacy model, which is obviously saying that learning to read and write is a good thing, but really it's what you learn to read and write, and more importantly, or most critically, for what, for why, why do you learn to read and write? For what would you learn to read and write? And that is, i.e., to develop, or to learn to understand the world, but also to develop your capacity to know and to act upon the world, to be an active revolutionary actor, to be a part of social change. And in Cuba today, still two-thirds of Cuban adults are involved in some kind of formal ongoing education. Like this is a country that had this massive, obviously when the revolution occurred, there was a huge increase in access and a huge overhaul of the education system and so on and so forth. But it's also something that's continued and is basically a permanent feature of the revolutionary project. That is, education ultimately as permanent community development, really. A bit more about that later. In terms of Venezuela, I've just got a couple of statistics up on the screen here. Again, a massive increase to access. You're talking about two countries that were, the education systems were extremely exclusive and elite. And so the first thing that had to happen, obviously, was just a massive increase in access. Just some of those stats on the screen there. I'm not sure if people are familiar, probably most people in this room are, with the missions, or the misiones as they're known in Spanish. Basically very widespread, nationally rolled out, state-funded and resourced social programs, largely education and health, but in a couple of other areas as well. And you can just see there some numbers, only to 2007, and it's increased further since then too. So, but ultimately, down there in 2008, 3.5 million essentially graduates have gone through those missions. Also, higher education enrolments, you can see, have increased dramatically. People can, perhaps I'll leave sort of details around that in discussion because I think, we can take that up in discussion. There's also obviously the Bolivarian education system. So alongside these social missions, which are feeding in and out of this new vision and this newly constructed education system, but there is also the reforms to the formal education system itself. And it's fascinating. It's a very slow and messy process because, and this was probably one of the most exciting things to see when I visited Venezuela recently was, the fact that a new curriculum was developed on the basis of nationally undertaken consultation sessions with students and teachers and communities all around the country. It wasn't up to scratch for a number of reasons, and so they've gone back and they're looking at it again. So there's sort of, you got the sense, even though I obviously didn't talk to everybody in the entire country, there was a very exciting sense of, this nationwide discussion about, well, what does a Bolivarian education system look like? Obviously there's talk about the values of the Bolivarian system and this 21st century socialism, but how does that translate into a formal education system? So from a teacher's point of view, from a pedagogical point of view, from all that sort of stuff, it's fascinating because it's the form and the content, it's what are we going to teach, but it's also how are we going to teach it. And it's nothing short of revolutionary, but the fact that the thinking and the decision making and the visioning is happening in the hands of those. I mean, a word here would be the word stakeholder or something like that would be used here. It doesn't feel quite enough in the context of Venezuela because it's Venezuelan people that are at the heart of that decision making. The constitutional reforms in 2007 state that education is a fundamental human right and a social obligation which is free, obligatory and democratic. The current focus on converting schools to the Bolivarian model is basically, as I said, about developing a new curriculum, but also, for example, thinking about the connections between school and community. So looking at how, there's an interesting, although it's quite unexplored because the consejos comunales, the new communal councils, are quite new themselves, but there's a really interesting discussion that's obviously going on around the relationship between something like the communal councils, which are developing as a form of local community organising and decision making, how that's connecting back in and out of the education system, which is all sort of a part of this process. Okay, and to go. Is that 10 minutes already?
Almost 20.
Wow. I'm on extra bit as always. I'm going to talk a bit faster.
Yes.
Okay. Right. Obviously, too, the question, access in and of itself is, particularly in the context of a of a re-envisaging of for what, for whom becomes equally as important. And obviously in Venezuela, there's been a particular emphasis on providing access for sections of the Venezuelan community that have literally, been completely excluded from education and pretty much from any aspect of, Venezuelan society. Urban, rural, poor, a range of other marginalised communities, obviously specifically ethnic communities within Venezuela, the Afro-Venezuelan community, which is no small minority, and absolutely the indigenous communities in Venezuela. And there's a lot to say about that too, which I don't have time to go into here. But what's also really interesting, and this is absolutely features of both Cuba and Venezuela, is the fact that accompanying these reforms are real changes in resourcing to actually make this, well, what we're hearing a hell of a lot of at the moment here with Kevin Rudd and co about this question of social inclusion. That is to say that, alongside access and reforms to education itself, the actual social and economic bases of disadvantage, so the barriers to full and meaningful participation and active participation in education are being removed. And there's some fantastic stories that came out of the Cuban Revolution, and there's some really, there's real similarities in terms of what's happening in Venezuela. The mass literacy campaigns that were rolled out in Cuba immediately after the revolution, not only tackled the education side of things, but they also raised a range of other social issues that they didn't know about outside of those literacy campaigns. I can't remember how many, but some huge number of glasses, reading glasses, were produced at one point because the volunteer brigadistas were coming back saying, look, we're teaching these people to read and write, but they can't bloody read because they can't see. And so there was this massive, rollout of spectacles and eye checkups and eye treatment that was rolled into the health reforms at that time. Childcare, housing, transport, all that sort of stuff. In Venezuela, it's a bit more formal actually, and I guess the point is too, Venezuela has, from the outset been very interested to learn from the model of Cuba, albeit, also very clear that this is a distinctly Venezuelan process. The missions that I spoke of a second ago, and it's up here, have a very formal structure that's attached that cuts across a national, a regional and a local level, where there are a number of these things called atenciones, which are essentially units attached to each of these education missions that recognise the fact that if you don't have a job, or you don't have a house, or you aren't eating properly, or whatever other thing that might get in your road and might not enable you, as I said earlier, to fully, meaningfully participate in education, then that will be addressed through these units of the mission. So there's a unit that actually looks at the housing situation facing the students who come into these missions. And of course too, the notion of student in Venezuela, as it was and continues to be in Cuba, is the population, because this is about young people, it's about